Good afternoon. This is Sharonda Sullivanoff. I'm going to actually start this conversation off by apologizing that I will not be able to be seen today just due to technical difficulties, but I am looking forward to a really robust conversation with all of you. Today's conversation will also include Kimberly Mays, who's a BPNN member in Washington State, and Timothy Phipps, who's a BPNN member in Oregon, and myself, Sharonda Sullivanoff, who's a BPNN member here in Washington State. We're going to go ahead and have a conversation elevating the impacts of COVID on parents involved in the child welfare system. And to set the context, we're going to show our agenda. And I'd like to just, thank you. So today's agenda is that we're going to look at the impacts of the Adoption Safe and Families Act, timelines for parents during COVID. We're going to hear directly from parents about how they're coping with the removal of their children during COVID and assessing service needs. We're going to understand how parents are dealing with virtual court hearings and the visitation with their children during COVID. And of course, we're going to hear directly from parents about challenges parents are experiencing and assessing necessary services to support their families and safely reunify. And then we're going to have a discussion and question and answers. So as I talk about today, what I'd like to be able to is just to set the context a bit. I'm also a parent ally. I've navigated child welfare. I'm a kinship care provider, and I work in direct contact with families that are navigating child welfare. So it's safe to say that I have a pretty well-rounded understanding of child welfare. In today's discussion, what we plan to cover are the barriers and experiences families currently navigating child welfare, and we want to better understand what their needs are today. And we will not be able to convey strongly enough the sense of urgency and the call of action needed. But I'm telling you, we are surely going to try. I realize that the majority of the public believe that CPS comes and it saves children from these horrifying parents, and that these children are far better off if they're placed in foster care. I have to tell you, nothing could be further from the truth. First, most of the children that are in child welfare are there due to neglect, and neglect falls into several different categories, and that the statute is actually quite ambiguous. So for today, I'm going to let you know that the vast majority of children are involved in this trauma-inducing system due to poverty. There are many other community indicators that precede a family into CPS, and a few are unemployment, homelessness, housing vacancies, and as you can imagine, COVID has exacerbated all of these conditions. There are those within our community that believe that the response to poverty is to call CPS and to produce, or to call CPS. And currently, there are many statewide campaigns creating alarmism within these communities. It immobilizes our community members. And I have to tell you that we, the people, and community resources are the answers for these families. We need to strengthen and build up our communities. And our community structures have been completely fractured by COVID. And they find themselves in a completely downward spiral. So when I look at our communities, what I can tell you is that we want to be able to have those resources. And currently, amid COVID, those are minimal at best for families that are navigating child welfare. So let's talk about why this is important. I just would like to present what it looks like currently to be in the middle of a CPS case in the middle of COVID. We have ASFA, and ASFA requires, or has a statute and a timeline that within 15 to 22 months, that if there hasn't been substantial progress in a child welfare case, that the state can petition to terminate parental rights. Pandemics do not follow ASFA timelines. I'd like to bring to you a story of a parent that is currently navigating child welfare. And prior to COVID, she had an incredible resistance to the services needed to reunify. As she begrudgingly went into treatment, she was abruptly removed due to a COVID scare inside of the facility and was catapulted back into homelessness. As she was catapulted back into homelessness, at the time she had no phone, no clothes, no place to live, and no contact with her children. Of course, in those conditions, hopelessness will overwhelm an individual. And at some point, quite recently, she decided that navigating child welfare was just too much. She has decided to relinquish her rights. Last week, I went and I met with her, and she met with her children to say goodbye because she was so absolutely devastated and hopeless that she just didn't want to try anymore, and that the ASFA timeline had dictated that her time was potentially running out. As we entered into the office, she was asked to mask up, and she was asked to stay 6 feet away from her children. The stress and the enormous burden that was on this woman at this time to not have to touch her children, to mask up and to speak to them without being able to show her mouth, to show a smile, to be able to see a smile and a comfort from her children was so overwhelming that she left. As she proceeded to try to make it onto a bus to get back to her homeless encampment, the bus passed her by because if the bus has too many people on it, you can't get on it. She was, of course, overwhelmed by grief, and I was able to pick her up, and I put her in my car, jeopardizing my own health, but the humanity in me would not let her sit so hopeless and removed from what was happening in her life. So when we talk about today's conversation and why it's important, I want you to think about women and men who are faced with all of the conditions of COVID and having to then navigate a system that says, sorry, the pandemic happened during your case, but we might actually consider terminating your rights via Zoom. Laura's story is what's important. And I hope that we prioritize the needs of families in the middle of COVID. Family First is a great beginning, but I must tell you, there is still work that needs to be done. There have been wonderful resources that have been coming, that have evolved, and one of those, in a response to COVID, is the Alliance Resiliency Project. This is a project with the Children's Trust Fund Alliance, and it's made possible with partnerships with Casey Family Programs. The project offers a variety of supports and resources for parents who are parent members of a 3-parent groups, and the Alliance helps to support. The purpose of this project is to help parent members of these groups navigate the challenges families may be experiencing during this pandemic. 2 components of this project are caring conversations, and I've had the honor of being a facilitator in meeting with our members weekly and really just taking an hour together and talking about what are the stressors, what are some of the coping skills, what are the considerations as we move forward week after week in what we call the new normal. Another part of the resiliency partnership or project is Touchpoint Parents. And these Touchpoint Parents are a peer support, and they help parents navigate the resources needed. They are one-on-one communication, and these peer support relationships really have helped bolster all of the unpredictability of being in the middle of COVID. So as we get ready to go and have conversations with Timothy and Kimberly, a couple logistics. I want to let you know that this conversation is actually being recorded. Timothy and Kimberly are going to speak further about the concerns with removals, visitation, transportation, housing, and court proceedings. But more importantly, what they're going to offer to you are some recommendations. I'm going to now turn it over to Kimberly.
Thank you, Sharonda. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kimberly Mays, and I'm happy to be here. I am a defense social worker, and I've worked hands-on with families for over almost 15 years, helping them be successful to reunite with their children. And I will be speaking about how parents are coping with the removal of their children during COVID, what it's like for parents to access services, resources, and supports, and the impact on reunification and permanency, how housing is a major barrier to reunification, how important it is for courts and the child welfare leaders to focus on expediting permanency hearings, including reunification and case dismissal hearings, and I will share some solutions to address these issues. As I reflect upon my work with parents and families in child welfare, I think about how parents are experiencing the same issues and barriers towards reunification with their children as they did before COVID, but that COVID has multiplied those barriers exponentially. It's off the charts. Let's start with the removals, because that's one of the most traumatic events for children and their parents. Children are being removed from their home and separated from their parents and their entire biological families. And unlike before COVID, parents cannot use their parental influence to physically hold, comfort, and reassure their children because in-person visits are put on hold indefinitely. On top of that, setting up virtual visits right after removal can take weeks and even months in some cases, as the department workers scramble to help parents, youth, caregivers, visit agencies get the equipment they need for the virtual visits. Therefore, the trauma experienced from the removal for both the children and their parents continues untreated and unresolved. When kids cannot see and touch their parents to ensure they are safe, they worry and fear the worst. And when parents do not see and touch their children, they experience great fear for their children's safety, especially during this pandemic. Untreated trauma manifests itself in children by them acting out in the foster homes and behavioral services when all they really need is to see and hold their parents and hear their parents say, everything is going to be all right, like any of our children would need. Parents are also concerned about bonding and attachment issues developing, especially those with very young children and infants. Research shows that bonding and attachment in infants and toddlers are developed by in-person contact, and virtual visits cannot facilitate that. One major solution to implementing safe in-person visits during COVID is to supply parents, children, and visit providers the same PPE and protection, personal protection equipment, and safety guidelines and procedures that keep essential workers safe in the field. People are going to grocery stores, gas stations, and other places, and essential workers are going to work every day. So we can use those same safety precautions so families can have visits. Many states are finding safe ways to have in-person visits, including here in my state. And those measures should be implemented in every jurisdiction so that families can have safe in-person visits. Parents are also majorly concerned about not having real-time access to services and resources, and how that impacted them being found in compliance and making progress in their court-ordered services plan, and how these not accessing services is also delaying reunification and permanency for their family. Parents need services to remedy their issues, and they need those services now. The leading issues parents need support in is substance use, mental health, treatment, housing, and transportation. Many services have long wait lists, taking weeks and months in some cases to even get an initial screening appointment. Affordable housing apartments have 6 months to 3 months wait lists, so many parents are not even able to access housing resources because the list is so long that they can afford. Substance use treatment centers are kicking people out. They initially, when COVID started, everyone was kicked out in Washington. Almost all the treatment centers just had a mass exit, right? And Sharonda already shared one story, and that's, you can just multiply that by every parent who got kicked out. And then now they're offering outpatient services, but the issue with that is parents who were diagnosed to need inpatient in order to mitigate their issues, or they would not have been evaluated at that level. There's higher rates of overdoses occurring because of inpatient treatment shutting down. People are dying. Parents are actually they need to be cleaned sober to even progress. So one idea is to partner with clean and sober homes in the community so they can replicate an inpatient environment so that we can get these parents inside and safe and working on their treatment plan. Many parents lost their jobs due to COVID, so they're really afraid that they can't reunite with their kids because they have no job and nowhere to live. So how can you reunite? Even though they've finished all their other case plan goals and they've overcome their issues, now they have no job in housing. Lack of housing and transportation resources, referrals not going out for months, long wait lists for services, no services in some areas, lack of frequent quality visits. All of these variables directly affect parent outcomes, which in turn affects our children's outcomes. A concerted effort around community building must begin now. Families need services and resources to heal their families now. One quick, cost-effective solution for families is to provide technical support to current service and resource providers that are already in the community serving families and help them build up their capacities and serve all families in their communities that need help. Child welfare leaders can partner with community leaders to create walk-in and call-in, one-stop shopping places for families to go that provide an array of services and supports in real time, and that includes transportation supports. Make sure families have access to service providers that reflect the community they make up, culture, language, etc., so that parents can trust and be understood and find a better connection with providers. And for families who need inpatient, again, let's partner with clean and sober housing so that we can get that rolling. And child welfare leaders can help increase the critical services that parents need by implementing telehealth services that provide children and families a lifeline to essential physical and behavioral health services that would not be otherwise available or accessible. As many of us already learned, telehealth has the potential to increase access to specialized medical and mental health expertise. They eliminate client transportation and time barriers. They enhance staff capacity to reduce travel time. Telehealth also increases capacity of services some clients to participate remotely, and those who don't like to show up to services or uncomfortable, they can participate remotely. And there's a great cost benefit from using telehealth for some of these services, especially now during this pandemic. Housing is another major barrier to reunification that parents face. In Washington, housing is the leading barrier to reunification. I have three parents on my own caseload now with Section 8 family reunification vouchers who have spent months trying to find a place to rent to them. Low income, poor criminal history, poor rental and credit histories are the leading barriers to parents passing screening criteria to be even accepted into places. So this needs to be work done on that. Also, many parents are really concerned about when this eviction moratorium expires, what's going to happen to them. So right now, some parents are living in places where they lost their job, but no one can be kicked out in Washington. So they're really afraid of how that's going to look at any moment when that's lifted. Also, there is a great need to educate child welfare leaders, lawmakers, and the public at large about the critical need to increase services and resources in every community, which is proven to strengthen families and to help keep families together safely and help families reunite safely who have been separated. We tell parents throughout their case to actively engage in your services and apply what you learn to your life. Show up to your visits to increase the bond with your kids. Do these things and we can return your children to your care. Many parents have worked hard to get to reunification, and the reward right now is not reunification, but rather wait. You can't touch your child indefinitely. Wait for the services you need for your family to heal. Or the worst one, we're ready to return home, but our hands are tied because of COVID. So the various parents' experience toward reunification due to COVID should be taken into account, and the AFSA timeline should not be counted against families during this time, as Sharonda mentioned. Parents will need time to re-engage in the services that were abruptly stopped because of COVID. Parents need time to regain employment, in some cases regain housing, and time to address the bonding and attachment issues that definitely has developed from no in-person visits. Let's not forget those parents who were looking at termination before COVID, but we're in the process of turning their cases around. I have 4 clients right now who are not doing very well. But right before COVID, I got them all engaged and they were up and running and now everything has stopped. So they need more time. So, and then another case I was on recently, just like Sharonda, the department, mom was doing well, but since the timeline has been so long, she has her own place working. She's in compliance with all her services, but they filed termination in April, right in the middle of COVID, right? Despite every community service provider agency shutting down for a period of time, despite parents not being able to go to court to address their barriers or their issues, despite in-person visits being suspended. The department cited the AFSA timeline in this meeting, and I had spoke up and said the AFSA timeline is an inhumane policy right now during COVID, and that should be a factor that we should look at and not follow the timeline right now, because that's not fair to families. So it's critical and essential that the courts and child welfare leaders ensure that permanency planning and permanency court hearings are a priority, in conjunction with ensuring families have real-time access to services and the supports they need to heal. It's not fair to parents who are in the process of having their children return home and at the very crux, or who are at the very crux of transition home, they were talking about transition, to have the process just halted because of COVID. Courts and child welfare leaders should both ensure permanency remains a priority, and they should focus on expediting permanency hearings, including reunification hearings and case dismissal hearings. They must be prioritized because families can be getting out of here much faster than they are. Legally free youth or youth whose permanent plan is guardianship should have the opportunity to expedite permanency, especially in these times where it's uncertainty. So Zoom hearings, virtual hearings can occur for those youth so they can move on. Virtual hearings are essential during this time to expedite reunifications, adoptions, and guardianship hearings, which can be done via agreed order. So it's really simple, what I'm finding out from my own practice, to get these things done. So how do we expedite and elevate those things? On the reverse side, the courts and child welfare leaders should push back termination proceedings until parents are given a viable opportunity to remedy the issues that brought their kids into care during this pandemic. They should have a viable opportunity, meaning help them get services through this pandemic. And if they don't comply, then we will look at termination, but not with those who are trying. That should be off the table. Then also, once older cases are closed out, if we expedite all these permanency hearings and the other cases that need to go out, guardianships, adoptions, then this will allow a faster response to those who are currently needing help, who remain in our system. So focusing on these families and getting them out, it will safely reduce the amount of cases in our system, saving our system money. It will increase the system's capacity to more effectively serve the families still here and those that are coming into the system. And it also better equip us to handle the onslaught that's predicted to happen once things start opening up. The calls that are supposed to be coming in that everyone's predicting, we can mitigate that better by getting families out now who can get out safely. Lastly, I want to share that parents drive the case plan, yet the outcomes child welfare tracks are only related to children. We need to prioritize gathering data on parent outcomes alongside the child outcomes, as this will help us to do a much better job at improving child outcomes. So we need to create a data system that tracks child, the parent, the system workers, because of all the delays they're incurring in our cases, in parents' cases, where they're delaying the cases themselves through taking referrals 6 months to be sent out, visits not happening for 4 months. How do we track those things? Until we start tracking data on parents who drive the car, whose outcomes predicate the outcomes of their children, and also the way to track the system workers who may delay because of turnovers or whatever reason, these cases, we're not going to identify all the barriers that preclude children from being safely reunited with their biological families. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kimberly, for all of that information and for your heart. Timothy?
Yeah, thanks, Sharonda. And Kimberly, it was wonderful to see you on the screen. Unfortunately, like you, Sharonda, I am having technical difficulties as well today, and so I'll only be able to join by audio. I want to thank everyone for being here today, and appreciate this opportunity to share some thoughts and ideas with you all. My name is Timothy Phipps. I'm a father here in Oregon. I'm a former child welfare consumer, and as a child, many years ago in California, and then again as a father with a child in care. more recently. Something that I would like to share with you all personally is as a child in care, I remember my visitation with my mom, and the first thing that I did every time that I got to see my mom was I'd run into her arms and we'd hold each other, you know, and just be able to have the whole world be okay for a few minutes. And as a father, more recently with my daughter in care, that's the first thing that we did as well. At each visit, when I'd see her every week, we would just embrace and just enjoy each other's presence. And I share that because the dads that I'm working with aren't able to experience that, and the children that are in care right now aren't able to experience that. By and large, a large percentage of those kids, you know, parenting time, or what we call visitation, is really essential. So it's considered the primary intervention for maintaining the parent-child relationship while children are in care. Kimberly and Sharonda shared a little bit about that, so I won't go into it, but I just want to acknowledge that the fathers that I work with, you know, for them, it's an incredible motivation when they're able to meet consistently with their children, and to feel like they're in that role of being a parent, because whether or not parents can be with their children or see their children, they're not in a parenting role. But we still identify as parents in our hearts and in our identity. And so our ability to do that for a little bit each week is critical for us to stay motivated and understand, to keep our children prioritized in our mind despite whatever else is going on in the world. Separating that contact, eliminating that contact in any way, is incredibly frustrating. It's incredibly disheartening. And it's a huge motivator for parents to be able to meet and parent their children for a short time each week. You know, developing and maintaining the integrity and sustainability of the nuclear family through frequent and consistent parenting time has to be considered essential to develop strategies around that. I also want to talk a little bit about the courts, and then I'll go in a little bit about technology. Kimberly touched on some of the issues that are happening with the courts, and one of the concerns that we're having here, joining from Oregon today, is that there are initial removals of children from the home and placement into care, and there are trials of termination happening, but the interim hearings are not happening. So there are hearings they're review hearings here in Oregon, where parents' progress and the progress of the case is reassessed periodically, and adjustments are made to the case based on that progress. Expanded visitation potentially, developing a plan for a transition back into the home with the parent potentially. All of those review hearings are not happening. So parents are not having equal access to justice essentially right now with the court system. They can experience removals and they can experience termination, but they can't experience anything on the other end, which is progress, and being able to demonstrate to the courts their willingness and their progress and their growth. Kimberly talked a lot about sort of the Adoption Safe Families Act timeline, and how termination simply shouldn't be happening right now if parents haven't had access to the services that the courts have required of them. And the terminations definitely shouldn't be happening by Zoom. They shouldn't be happening virtually. It can be the most significant time in a parent and a child's life, and it's such a huge decision that for it to happen by Zoom is really, really challenging. One of the things that parents are talking about is that although attendance may be up in participation in virtual court hearings, virtual proceedings, that parents are much more distracted and unable to assess what's happening in the hearing, and unable to determine if there are any new court orders, why those court orders are happening, because they're not absorbing as much and understanding as much of the process when that happens virtually. And so that's a little bit of one of the pieces about technology as well, is that is that those court hearings are really, really challenging for parents to happen virtually. And I understand that there are courts around the nation who don't have access to that sort of technology. I would hope that by limiting participation to legal parties, they could still have hearings and proceedings moving forward. You know, we talk a lot about access to services, and Kimberly touched on this as well. You know, I work with a lot of parents who present with substance use disorder, and it's been our experience here on the ground that the delivery of that service through virtual means has not been effective for parents as it has been through the delivery of in-person. And parents simply are falling off, you know, with all of the concerns and all of the additional stressors. A lot of parents will tend to default to their known coping mechanisms, which is sending a lot of folks back into a recurrence of use and really being experiencing that on top of everything else that's already going on. And I guess one other piece about the technology is that in the event that children can't be, in the event that agencies can't strategize how to do parenting time, say outside in the park, or find some place to be able to do that is in compliance with distancing guidelines, that all parents need to be, I think the agency has a responsibility to provide all parents and children with the technology needed to have virtual parenting time, virtual visits, provide for parents with phones with data plans that are significant enough that no matter where in the country you live, that those data plans will support frequent and consistent communication with their children, and particularly for children who are younger, much younger. I think working through a very, very small phone, perhaps 6 inches, is really, really challenging. Younger children need a bigger screen, something that's tablet size so that they can actually see their parents and be able to catch on to some of those emotive expressions and some of those other things that are happening, be able to look in their parents' eyes potentially. It's very, very difficult for children, and particularly young children, to do that through the phone. And so again, I appreciate the time today and look forward to having further discussion. And thank you all for being here. Sharonda?
Thank you so much, Timothy, for all that you shared. We're now going to turn it over to Christine Claplin, the Managing Director, Public Policy over at Casey Family Programs. Christine?
Thanks, Sharonda. And it's a pleasure for me to be with all of you today and to have just a few minutes to talk some about a lot of the messages that have been lifted up by these incredible presenters, and to have a conversation with all of you and a dialogue. We here at Casey Family Programs have long valued our ongoing partnership and engagement with voices of parents and those with lived experience in child welfare, recognizing there really is no better way to understand what's happening on the ground. And I think we can universally agree COVID has challenged with the pandemic the system in so many ways that no one could have predicted. And I think we can universally agree that more than ever, family support at its core is going to be such an important path to bring our families and children out of this. So what does that mean for the child protection system, and in particular, as we're really trying to think about right now, what are we most concerned about? All of the speakers have identified the focus in federal law on really trying to be sure children were placed with an urgency towards permanency. And that value of children having permanency is so critical. The reality, though, is the timeline at the federal level that allows the state to pursue terminating parental rights of children who've been in care for 15 of 22 months is something that just needs to be recognized. The federal law allows for courts to have discretion to look at circumstances and to really make sure that it's appropriate to terminate the parental rights. We need to make sure this is happening. As the parents have talked about, the plans they're under from the states that are requiring them to comply in a host of ways to purely be back with their children are becoming harder and harder for them to realize and meet with all of the challenges that we're experiencing. We need to be looking at ways to help them, and in the meantime, we need to be sure that everyone is exercising appropriate flexibility and that no termination of parental rights is happening that is inappropriate. And the second piece of this more broadly is that at the federal level, we have long felt and believed how important it was that children be with their parents. The law has always required at a federal level that no child should be removed from their parents unless the state provided reasonable efforts that allow that child to remain safely with them. There is a wide discretion in what reasonable efforts means. States have defined it differently. The federal level, we're constantly trying to understand what this could look like and how to use it. But I think as we're looking at the reality of how the pandemic has impacted parents, understanding what's reasonable really needs to be lifted up to really be sure that before we are even removing a child from their family, that we have reasonably and appropriately tried to support them. And, you know, right now, as ever, what we're contemplating and really trying to look at is the data of children in the system has long pointed to the reality that the majority of these children will be reunified with their parents. We have always felt there should be an urgency to that. We're concerned about the pandemic prolonging this separation unnecessarily, and we're concerned about systems and others having the right guidance and resources to really think about how to bring these children back to their families safely and as quickly as possible. We've put into the chat, excuse me, but I'll just point to it as well. Pardon me. But our partners at the American Academy of Pediatrics, bear with me for 2 seconds here. The beauty of a Zoom video, but our partners at the American Academy of Pediatrics have issued guidance to really look at how to facilitate items such as safe visitation, how to allow the contact that the parents here spoke so eloquently about for them to be with their children to happen in a safe and appropriate way. We have resources, we have partners who are helping us to think differently and to address these challenges in a new way. We need all of them at the table, and we need at our core to make sure that our parents have the opportunity to be with their children. So, Sharonda, let me turn it back to you, and thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this.
Thank you so much, Christine. I really appreciate all that you offered there. And I'd just like to offer just a very quick summarization and a thought. I think about children who have lost so much in the midst of COVID. They have lost their social, their schools, their teachers, parents, whatever type of normalcy and consistency that they had. And here we are in the middle of COVID, and some may propose that they lose their parents forever. I think that at the end of the day, we need to look at ourselves as humane people, recognizing that this crisis requires us to mobilize in a way that we never have before. We must be flexible, we must have the considerations, and we must be activated in a way that we've never been before. We are a nation that needs the resources so that people, even outside of child welfare, are able to get their needs met. So as we move into discussion, I really encourage everyone, if you would like, there is a chat box. Please put your questions there. If I don't, I'm going to go ahead and just offer a question to the panelists. I'm sorry, I'm trying to see this question here. So I'm going to ask this question to the panelists. What can Congress do to help support more or improve visitation between parents and children right now?
Yeah, so this is Timothy. I'll go ahead and speak to that. I think what we have is the interpretation, I think, of what is essential has been is varied widely, not only between states, but respective jurisdictions within states, and some sort of a unified guidance around what the expectation is that aligns with, the reason that visits are recognized as important and mandated by law when can happen, that be presented as the default, and that circumstances that would potentially prevent that would be what needs to be discussed, as opposed to not having visitation as the default, and then discussing case by case about circumstances that would allow for that. I think the default needs to be an expectation that children will be able to visit with their parents, and that extenuating circumstances be considered, as opposed to the other way around.
Thank you, Timothy.
And this is Christine. I would just like to add to that, Sharonda, very quickly. At the federal level, the Children's Bureau has put out considerable guidance to support state leaders and jurisdictions and partners in trying to sort of think through how best the systems can support parents and families. I think, though, it's important right now, and Timothy lifted this up, that we begin to recognize that virtual isn't universally better, and that we continue to encourage and remind good practice and what the law has required around urgency and engagement and working directly with families, and lifting up that there are resources to do this, rather than perhaps finding solutions or ideas that seem to delay this even longer in an unnecessary way. And it's the balance of how we do this safely and appropriately with the recognition that we have the resources to do that. And we know we have more information now than we did 2 months ago. And so it's time to really be lifting up that information and lifting up the expectation of really continuing to support parents and children in this system.
Thank you so much. We have Kara, who is also a part of our panelists here. Kara, do you have questions that the attendees have offered?
Yeah, Sharonda. Erica Jefferson has asked, what is the proposed alternative to virtual hearings?
This is Kimberly Mays.
Go ahead.
This is Kimberly Mays. My thinking is that for virtual hearings to be utilized for cases less sensitive than terminations and other sensitive hearings, but that they definitely should not be used for termination or relinquishment hearings of that kind. That's what I think about that. But if they do have in-persons for terminations, use PP guidelines and safety measures, because people are meeting people, like I said, people are going to grocery stores or to gas stations. We're still in this, make a safe encounter for those court hearings.
And I'll just add myself too, that the court hearings currently that can occur or do occur, I think do not take into consideration what is happening for people. People are under an enormous amount of stress, and the court setting just adds to that. There might be a need for a delay. If we're talking about children going home, virtual settings seem quite appropriate. But if we're talking about removing people's parental rights under the strain and stress of COVID, we might want to be able to take a little bit of a delay, a hiatus, as we try to, figure out our next steps. I just think it's the most humane way to approach some of this. I know that sometimes that might not be the most sought out answer, but I also just think about how we're leaving people and the very limited resources that they have in place to actually address the need when things like this occur.
Well, and this is Timothy, and there are undoubtedly some jurisdictions around the nation who won't have access to the technology needed to maintain their docket. And I think that one of the suggestions would be to, so court hearings are often open to a variety of parties other than the legal parties, support people, service providers, relatives, things of that nature. And while I always advocate for families to have support in the courtroom with them, potentially limiting in-person hearings and proceedings to legal parties could significantly reduce the number of people actually in person at a meeting.
Thanks for that, Timothy. Our next question comes from Gregory Cox. He asks, public schools are about to start. I believe 65 to 75% of hotline calls are made by school professionals. How can we work with those parents to prevent a hotline call?
Well, I think, to be honest with you, this is Sharonda, I think we're missing a fantastic opportunity. If you look at the data, what the data says is an enormous amount of calls come into the hotline, and very few of them meet the threshold of what is actually required for CPS intervention. I think that we are in a Zoom platform. I think that we have the opportunity to really inform our mandated reporters and to give them the access to the type of community resources that are actually the more appropriate response to the need of families. I think that people call CPS because they need to call someone. And what we should be able to do is just provide them with an alternative so that they're not draining that system in a way that is unnecessary.
Hey, Sharonda, I tend to agree with that. 80% of calls made by educators are screened out at screening. And I too have that concern about children returning to school. I know that there are some days where I'm so daunted by everything that's going on that my presentation may not be what people normally expect from me. And I see the potential for children returning to school whose presentation may seem, it may present as distant, stressed and depressed. And does that constitute the need for neglect or a call? I think agencies, there are agencies around the nation who are making a concerted effort to communicate and develop clear lines of communication with educators to help them understand alternative resources to reach out to if they're concerned, sort of vague concerned about children and children's care. Yeah, so that it is a huge concern, and I think agencies, by developing those strong relationships with educators, can potentially prevent a lot of that those initial reports coming in.
And this is Kimberly Mays, and I just wanted to piggyback on what Sharonda said regarding the need of the data around the families that come in and mandated reporters. So again, it's a great idea to change to focus on helping mandatory reporters become mandatory referrers. But the basic problem with all our families across the nation is lack of the resources actually being there. So say we create a great system to get mandated reporters to be mandated referrals to take all those calls, screen out calls, et cetera, right? If we have wait lists right now that are astronomical, then there's nowhere to refer people to. So until we start building infrastructure within the communities that already exist and helping them build capacity and recognize that we have 5-year earmarked, we already have budgets lined up, child welfare budgets lined up 5 years out, predicting how many kids are going to come in, blah, blah, blah. If we go out 5 years, borrow 2 years, year 4, 3, 4, and 5's money, pull it back here, invest in the communities to build up their capacity to serve every family in their communities, then we can have a cost savings at the end, because we can talk all we want about saving families, but until we build something in the communities for families to go and not wait months to be seen, and now they have worse problems than they started with, then we're just talking.
All right, thank you, everyone. It's such great insights, and I think a lot of great information is being shared. There's a lot in the chat box of people complimenting your remarks and appreciating what you've been sharing. And I know we're getting tight on time, but I'd like to elevate one more question that came in, and it was in regards to how can funding be redirected to help support parents?
Creating new service, adding to the services that are already in the community so that people can be served and healed.
And I think on a federal level and state level, it's the prioritization. I mean, I know that as funding is allocated, it has a specific destination. Why aren't we creating the destination to reunification? Why aren't we investing in the needs of parents? We have a way of seeing them as undeserving. All people are deserving of restoration and help. So we need to redirect, liberalize your federal funding stream so that states have the option and opportunities to use the funding to support their members.
Yeah,
I would just offer, oh, I'm sorry, this is Christine. I would just offer sort of a couple additional comments. At the federal level, we have for decades predominantly only funded foster care, which is dollars that go to support the removal of children. Congress took an enormous step forward with Family First in terms of creating a pathway for states and jurisdictions to draw down services that support parents, that support caregivers in allowing them to remain with their children and support them. And the states leading the way in implementation on Family First are putting together a playbook on what that can look like. There continues to still need more work to be done in this space. And I think building off the earlier comments too on the concerns that have been sort of largely floated in the press around school openings and what that will mean. Generally, when a call has come to CPS, it's sort of too late. We have missed an opportunity to engage with the family in an earlier way. The CARES Act and so many other pieces of legislation have put resources out there that were intended to get into the hands of families. We need to really understand if these dollars are getting into the hands of families and how they could be getting there better.
This is Kimberly Mays, and just to piggyback on that, I've come to learn that if it's not measured or tracked, it won't be funded. So in response to what Shonda said about redirecting funding, if we begin to start tracking or measuring parent outcomes, then funding may follow as well. So just throw that in as well, how we can redirect funding by tracking, creating measurements for parents as we do children and different other measures. And then that funding has to follow that if we're going to measure something. So.
And this is Kara. It has been a very powerful hour of being together. And so I'm just going to pass it to Sharonda to close us out. And I just want to thank you. I know there were additional questions that came in, so please feel free to follow up. The BPNN network is here to support you and keep getting important conversations like this lifted up. Sharonda?
Thank you so much, Kara. And I want to thank Christine, Kimberly, and Timothy for all that you offer today and brought to our attentions. I want to thank everyone who took the time out of their day to listen, to hear us. I hope that you will take this information back to your jurisdictions and that you will be activated in a way that you weren't prior to this call. We want to thank you once again for your time and efforts, and we certainly look forward to hearing the wonderful effects that you are affecting in your communities. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.